Hi, my name's Vince Sheehan and today I'd like to talk about Mozart's Symphony number 40 in G minor. I'd like to go through this famous work exploring its structure because I do believe that having some understanding of the form in music can greatly aid our appreciation and enjoyment of it. Now Mozart composed this along with the 39th in E flat and the 40th, the Jupiter in C major, in 1788, round about the summertime. All three works, all three masterpieces. And he kept a diary at this time. We know that this particular symphony, the 40th, was completed on the 25th of July 1788. No one's completely sure if it was ever performed in Mozart's lifetime. Some people think it was because he made revisions to the score, adding clarinet parts. But no one really knows for sure. But whatever happened, these last three symphonies, including this central one, are certainly supreme achievements in Western art music, and that's perhaps an understatement. Now the symphony is the second G minor symphony Mozart composed. There's only two in the minor key, and this of course begins in the first movement with one of the most famous melodies ever written. The first movement is in sonata form, it should be said, and the first subject of course goes like this. Kind of proto-romantic, I guess, in its emotional range, and even before that melody starts in the violas, which are subdivided, we have this kind of clock, this ticking clock. Really effective way to prepare a sort of melody. We then begin to hear the melody again, but this actually acts as a transition. We're changing key from G minor, the home key, to the relative major B flat major. Then we're into this tutti, still part of the transition. And so on. And then eventually that takes us to the second subject, and as is often the case, far more relaxed. We hear this interplay between strings and the bassoons and clarinets. This is the chief melody in the second subject group. But there are actually various motifs. It's quite a densely packed group, the second subject area. And then a bit further on in the second subject group, we hear the first subject rear its head again, this time of course in the relative major. Just that kind of da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da idea largely. And so on. We hear some scales rushing up and down, and eventually we hit the Codetta. And then we're back to the usually a repeat of the Exposition, etc. The development is by and large based on that first subject rhythm. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. It begins in F sharp minor. Notice every time it's going down the semitone in the sequence. And then we come to this really exciting part of development where the cellos and basses take up the melody and the bassoons. And over the top we have this exciting passage work on the on the violins, and we hear that melody just being thrown about the orchestra in a thrilling way. Eventually we reach this climax, this moment of crisis. Something like that anyway, and the things die down, dies down, dies down. We're back into the recapitulation. Etc, etc. And listen out for the solitary bassoon line there as well as a kind of counter subject. The transition this time in the recapitulation is one of the strokes of genius in this movement. First time it's fairly straightforward, moving us from G minor to B flat major. But this time Mozart is preparing us to stay in G minor for the second subject, and the transition is stretched apart, and the idea in that transition is worked out in a beautiful and meticulous way. Something like that anyway. And then we get to the second subject in the tonic minor. Again, we're between the strings and the winds. Again, like before, it's a group of ideas with hints of the first subject rhythm in. The Codetta skipped for a brief coda, again based on the first subject idea, before the music builds and erupts into a grand minor key climax. The second movement in E flat major, the Andante, like the first movement, is in sonata form. There's a rather leisurely and graceful pace to this music. It begins with the first subject in the exposition, which is this rather graceful overlapping idea in the strings, first heard on the violas, seconds, firsts, and so on. We hear it again. I think Beethoven probably took this as the inspiration for the second movement of his first symphony. There are parallels here. The transition builds on this kind of chirping idea. Da 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 da. We hear this on the firsts. Da-dum, 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 like birds chirruping. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. We then have this beautiful passage where they hear that chirruping motif coming down in the winds. Da-da, 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 da-da. And underneath we're reminded of the first subject. Da-da, da, 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 da. And it has this culminative power, very beautiful. Really tugs at the heartstrings. Eventually we get to the second subject, rather charming. So on. Da, 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 da. And then we have a Codetta, again based on that chirruping idea. the exposition may be repeated. The development, the scope of this music suddenly is broadened. We begin very quietly, and in the winds we have these big chords. Dum, 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 dum. Dum, 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 bang, 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 bang. So there's this dynamic contrast between piano and the strings and these forte chords in the winds. And basically the development is made up of that chirruping idea, da-da, 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 passed around the orchestra. And eventually we get to the recapitulation, the first subject, the transition, that beautiful transition. The second subject, this time in E flat major, before the Codetta, and that brings this beautiful movement to an end. The third movement, as you'd expect, is a minuet and trio, but it's perhaps not music readily danceable. We begin like this with this great tune. So on. We then have a continuation of that melody. So on. Stirring, emotional music. We have a rather quiet end to that A section on the woodwinds. The B section is a lot gentler, a more rustic feeling, of course. And then that's extended with these arpeggios in the bass and these descending scalic ideas in the winds. And then that takes us to the end of the B section, and we're back to the etc. The finale, the Allegro assai, is again in sonata form, and we begin with this sprightly idea in the firsts. We have an extension of that. And rather, perhaps maybe a Turkish, the Turkish or gypsy flavour to this music. We have a rather busy transition. Which then brings us to the second subject, which goes like this. We hear in the first violins, now in B flat major. And so on and so forth. That eventually takes us to a Codetta. And then back to etc. If we're having a repeat of the exposition. The development of the finale is surely one of the greatest developments in any symphony. It really is incredible. And it must have sounded so strange to the first listeners of this symphony, particularly the kind of the harmonic territories Mozart goes in. I mean, it sounds a bit like a tone row, something Schoenberg would write at the beginning of this. Very odd, isn't it? But absolutely thrilling. These chromatic detours, if you like. And then that is echoed between the strings. And we have this fugue-like section based on that arpeggio motif. Tremendously clever, tremendously sophisticated, tremendously exciting. And then we have more toing and froing between the winds and the strings before we hit the recapitulation. We have this pause at the end of the development, everything stops, and then all of a sudden we're back into etc., back into G minor. We have the transition, which then takes us into the second subject, this time in the tonic minor. Before we have the thrilling Codetta again to round off this extraordinarily powerful symphony. Thanks for watching. If this is your kind of thing, please click like and subscribe. Check out my other video on the Jupiter Symphony and the Mozart Requiem. And if you've got any pieces you'd like me to look at, any symphonies, anything at all, please put them in the comments below and I'll see if I can add them to my list. Thanks a lot. Bye.